Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest, or multiple guests, or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's episode, I'm unpacking a paper titled, What If Freire Had Facebook? A critical interrogation of social media woke culture among privileged voices in music education discourse by William Coppola. And yes, it said music education discourse, as I've done multiple times in previous episodes. I like to unpack scholarship in a variety of domains in education and consider what might this mean for the field of computer science education. Here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, in this paper, I critique the ways in which music education professionals, especially the privileged voices within our field, engage in dialogue through social media outlets such as Facebook. While social media has become a valuable and ubiquitous discursive tool within our field, especially in that it theoretically removes the ivory tower of dialogue in academia, here I critique its darker side. Were he alive today, I question how philosopher Paulo Freire would respond to the dialogical opportunities afforded by social media and the emergence of woke culture. Particularly, when engaging in the work of anti-racism, I highlight how privileged music educators can silence any dialogue through their hostility or fragility, alike through various forms of call-out culture, cancel culture, virtue signaling, and tone policing. I draw upon the full corpus of Freire's works to examine the overall veracity of these approaches to anti-racist efforts and offer that Freire's pedagogy was interminably rooted in humility, love, and the pursuit of shared humanity, end quote. If I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I'd say that this paper summarizes Paulo Freire's works and hypothesizes how Freire may have responded to some forms of woke culture. This paper is available for free. You can find a direct link to it in the show notes, which is available at jaredoleary.com, or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on. You'll also notice there that this podcast is powered by Boot Up Professional Development, which is the nonprofit that I work for. If you haven't checked it out yet, go to bootuppd.org. and take a look at the free curriculum that I created, or learn more about our paid professional development. And by the way, if you haven't listened to the episodes or read the book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I have a 4-part series on it, one for each of the chapters in the book. So I'll link to those in the show notes. If you haven't listened to those yet, maybe start there and then come back to this episode. So the author begins the paper by describing how many people have critiqued the ivory tower nature of academia, or even the slow nature of it in terms of not being able to respond. Like I had a publication take 3 years after I wrote it until it finally came out, just because of publication related delays. So a lot of academics, or a lot of people engaging in conversations around social justice and equity, are turning towards social media outlets like Facebook or Twitter or wherever to engage in discourse around anti-racism, anti-racist practices and pedagogies, etc. Now, a lot of educators who engage in this kind of dialogue are doing so in ways that might quote Freire. However, the author argues in this particular article that even though you're saying you're engaging in dialogue a la Paulo Freire, you might not actually be. And you might actually be making some things worse. So this author kind of takes a look at that in a polite critique on how we might actually engage in this advocacy work in ways that might be more beneficial than we're currently doing. All right, so here's a quote from page 17. I'm going to modify music educators like throughout these quotes that I'll read and change it to computer science educators, just so it's not a jarring like, wait, what? So here's a quote from page 17. Quote, recent trends like call-out culture, cancel culture, virtue signaling, and tone policing suggest a timely need to reflect on Freire's ideal of humanization and question at what ends it should be imagined. Do such acts humanize by bringing us closer to a shared social justice vision, or do they dehumanize, as Roberts offers, by impeding upon our dialogical ethos and liberatory aims, particularly when white and white-presenting computer science educators, already overrepresented in our academic spaces, utilize the same resources as afforded to all through social media? They have the potential to overpower those that most need to be heard, the voices of the marginalized. When these exchanges become riddled with either mean-spirited call-out and self-regulatory virtue signaling behaviors on the one hand, or silencing tactics or tone policing on the other, dominant voices run the risk of becoming a vitriolic megaphone of whiteness, potentially drowning out the marginalized despite their intentions, end quote. And by the way, in case you don't know, I should share my own positionality on this. I'm a white, non-binary individual. I have many sorts of privileges, whether it be my level of education, socioeconomic status, cultural capital or wealth, etc. So even though this is a white individual calling out whiteness, this is me sharing an interesting perspective that I think white people in particular could benefit from listening to or reading if you want to read the whole thing. I enjoyed the paper. I think it has some interesting perspectives to consider, and I hope that this episode helps you. So at the end of this introduction, the author says, okay, well, here's the two things that I'm trying to do with this particular paper. One is to challenge privileged voices, and then two is to reframe a potential approach for engaging in emancipatory dialogue, a la Paulo Freire. And again, if you haven't listened to the episode on it, I think it's chapter 3 in particular that talks about Freire's use of dialogue and the importance of it. Now, the author also provides their positionality. They said that they, too, have many privileges and are a white individual and have white fragility despite trying to be aware of it and trying to limit it through self-reflection. It's one of those things that they can't fully get rid of. And so that their social blind spots may kind of manifest themselves in their writing. And I guess I should give the disclaimer that I too might have some social blind spots that will manifest itself in this podcast or in any of the others that I do or any of the other presentations, publications, etc. So if you happen to notice something that like I might not be aware of, feel free to reach out to me and we can have either a private conversation or a public one and turn it into a podcast episode, kind of unpack some of the problematic things I might unintentionally be saying that I'm not aware of. There is a contact me button on my website if you're interested in that conversation. So here are 4 things that the author mentions that they are trying to do. Quote, 1, listening more than I talk in an attempt to center the experience of BBIA, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian people rather than bringing attention to my own self-edification. 2, learning about anti-racist work through personal research and conversations with other dominant voices to avoid burdening BBIA people with the task of educating their white colleagues. 3, working toward a comfort with discomfort so as to remain both non-defensively accepting of criticisms toward my role in perpetuating systemic racism and receptive to opportunities for self-growth. And 4, finding ways to engage in anti-racist efforts in a way that both support and uplift BBIA people without drawing attention away from their efforts, end quote. And the author goes on to say that the intended audience for this is white educators. The author notes that if white educators are in fact, quote, truly committed to supporting and uplifting BBIA voices, we must re-examine the actions we take in the name of allyship or co-conspiratorship. Do our behaviors center BBIA people or ourselves? Do our words bring more profit to our egos, not to mention our professional standings, than their livelihoods? End quote. It's from page 20. All right, so in the next section, the author kind of summarizes some of Paulo Freire's work, like discussions around what does banking mean in education. But because I've already done 4 episodes related to Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I'm going to skip that. So you're welcome to listen to those episodes or read the couple of pages on this. And there's also some critiques that are offered here, which I do provide some critiques at the end of episodes in the form of like some questions, some things to consider, or just some lingering thoughts that I have. But kind of 2 of the main ones that are mentioned here is like, one is that the approach may actually exacerbate some of the power hierarchies that exist between teachers and students. And then another one is that it kind of centers Western epistemologies and kind of lacks a nuanced discussion around feminism and anti-racism, which the author mentions that Freire adjusts later on in their discourse and says, yeah, you're right, I should talk about this more. And so later publications that came out after Pedagogy of the Oppressed, they do talk about some of that stuff more. So if you want to read more about the critiques, check out pages 22, 23. But starting at the end of page 23 is kind of a conversation around, well, what are some of the terms that are going to be discussed that are related to woke culture? So first we're going to start with, what does it mean to be woke? So here's a quote from page 24. Quote, being woke, in effect, quickly evolved from a genuine expression of one's awareness of racial injustice to a self-promotive way for mostly white people to disingenuously articulate their social consciousness. Maya Binyam likened the self-interested pursuit of wokeness to participating in the woke Olympics, where white people's obsession with appearing socially conscious became more about winning a game than actually inspiring social change. Binyam explained that the rules of the game included naming racism whenever it presents itself and condemning other white people who are lagging behind. Successfully isolating your opponent is how you win the match. The best players are those who accumulate the names of people who are racist or of things that have racism in them. Woke Olympians, in other words, are frenetic curators of the most obvious aggressions. They launch a series of condemnations in tweets, Facebook statuses, album reviews, and call it cultural critique. End quote, from page 24. Now, the next terms that the author discusses is call-out culture and cancel culture. For cancel culture, that is when somebody views somebody else's behavior or actions or discourse as so problematic that engaging in any kind of conversation with them would be pointless. So the only possible response that one can do is to erase their existence not engage with them, not mention them, etc. And obviously, I mean metaphorically, erase their existence, not literally. On the other hand, we have the call out behaviors, which are publicly calling out things that you determine to be problematic. Then the author mentions there's also another approach that's similar to call out, but is called calling in, where you try and privately engage in dialogue with the person to help them understand how what they are saying or doing might be problematic. However, the author mentions that this might have the effect of reinforcing white fragility. Another term that the author mentions is virtual signaling, which is sometimes also referred to as moral grandstanding or performative allyship. So the author cites Tosi and Wormk, says that there are 5 ways that people engage in these grandstanding behaviors. Here's a quote from page 26. Quote, "First is the act of 1, piling on, which occurs when a grandstander wishes to get in on the action regarding something that has already been said. For instance, they may re-articulate a seemingly woke comment in their own words in an attempt to achieve the same woke points as someone else. They may also, 2, ramp up by making increasingly strong claims about the matter in question in order to communicate even greater outrage, thus implying superior morality. Third, they may 3, trump up by insisting on a moral problem where none reasonably exist, or express 4, excessive outrage, where the wokest person is the one who expresses the greatest degree of repugnance. Finally, 5, claims of self-evidence occur when a person signals that their morality is above public discourse. For example, responding to an offensive statement by commenting, 'If you cannot understand how this is problematic, then I refuse to engage you any further,' end quote. So each of those 5 are some examples of virtue signaling or moral grandstanding. So why is this a problem? Well, the author mentions that it could increase cynicism, could also increase what the author refers to as outrage exhaustion, which can make it difficult to figure out various degrees of offenses, to figure out when actual outrage is important and appropriate, and then it can exacerbate the group polarization that has been going on for quite some time now. If I say the words midterm elections, that might ring the bell on some examples of group polarization that goes on. Another potential problem is that because of all this virtue signaling that's going on, is people might look at this and go, I'm going to remain silent because I don't want to appear as though I am engaging in virtue signaling, which is something that I felt for quite some time. And you'll notice a shift over 2 years ago in the podcasts, where it's nope, I can't remain silent. Even if it comes across as virtue signaling, I will try and learn from those moments where it comes across that way, so I can continue to improve my dialogue. Because while I think that virtue signaling can be a problem, I also think that we need to be more public about conversations around equity in CS education, or just education at large, or, in general, everywhere. So the next term that the author mentions is something called tone policing. So the author has a quote from Mira Sukharov on page 27 that says that tone policing, quote, originated in social justice circles to critique the phenomenon of someone inappropriately trying to control the way a marginalized person relays their experience of oppression. They accuse tone police of focusing on oppressed people's emotional intensity to deflect from the actual message in order to avoid doing something about oppression and marginalization. End quote. So as a generic example of what tone policing might look like, you might think of instances where a group of people or a person is oppressed and they get upset about it and basically say something like, hey, why are you oppressing me? This is problematic because of A, B, and C. The oppressors tone police when they say, you shouldn't be upset. That's not how you're supposed to communicate. You need to engage in a more civil conversation, blah, 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 blah. As opposed to actually addressing the points made with A, B, and C that were examples of forms of oppression. They focus on, well, you use the tone of voice that I don't like. So completely sidesteps the actual issue and ownership of the problem and focuses on controlling somebody who is being oppressed in a way that might be described as gaslighting. Here's a quote from page 28. Quote, the person engaging in tone policing is said to be making an ad hominem attack against the interlocutor by focusing on personal qualities, i.e., their emotionality, rather than the validity of their arguments. On the other hand, the victim of tone policing is said to be committing the logical fallacy of appeal to emotion, argumentation ad passions, end quote. And a little bit further down, quote, tone policing requires the oppressed to play the game according to the oppressor's rules, end quote. All right, so the next section starting on page 28 is titled A Freirean Interrogation of Social Media Woke Culture. Here's a couple of quotes from page 28 that are interesting to consider. Quote, first, Freire likely would have been an outspoken proponent of woke culture as it originated among Black people, but would have deeply problematized its whitewashing as it began to decenter Black voices in favor of white-centric self-proclamations of social awareness, end quote. A little bit further down on that page. Quote, he also likely would have seen white people's adoption of wokeness as a potentially well-intentioned but disingenuous attempt to proclaim their solidarity, simply because naming one's oppression can only be done by the marginalized, never for the marginalized, end quote. Now, when it comes to call-out culture, cancel culture, etc., Freire, according to the author, would very likely have said that this is a necessary part of dialogue. Although it can be uncomfortable, it needs to be done. However, the way that people call out can come across as dehumanizing, rather than actually engaging in open dialogue. So that approach can end up just flipping the oppression, so that those who were the oppressors now become the oppressed. So an example of that, I've been to some conference sessions where some outspoken feminists have engaged in what I would consider to be oppressive acts towards men, which I don't understand, because in their presentations, they talk about how problematic it is to engage in such behaviors towards women, so therefore they're going to do it towards men? I understand that some people like to take the approach of giving somebody a taste of their own medicine, but if a behavior is problematic when it's being done to you, why would you do it to somebody else? So the same thing happens with cancel and call out culture. The ways that people engage in calling out somebody can in fact become dehumanizing, abusive, or at the very least problematic. So here's a quote from page 30 that's important to consider. Quote, shaming and ridiculing one's interlocutor through ad hominem attacks, for instance, or irrevocably associating them with a hate group such as the KKK, reduces them to objects and rejects their subjectivity for personal growth and transformation. This, to Freire, is the work of dehumanization. End quote. I think that's a really important thing to consider. The ways that people sometimes communicate online can treat people as immutable objects that are incapable of transformation or growth or evolution, however you want to consider it. And this is problematic. Like when I was younger, I engaged in behaviors and said and did things that I no longer do because I've grown. I've learned that, even though I might intend it as a joke, it might not be received that way. Or going a bit deeper, some of the things that I thought and said were based around biases that were unconscious to me at the time. And I now understand were problematic. And to go even deeper, I have biases that are problematic right now that I'm not aware of. But the only way that I can become aware of it is by continuing to reflect and engage in dialogue. So acknowledging that who I was 5 years ago is different than who I am today, which is different than who I'm going to be 5 years from now. And so we need to consider that when engaging with people online as well. Somebody might say something that is sexist or racist, transphobic, homophobic, etc. They might not be aware of it. So we don't need to treat them as lesser than human by objectifying them and saying, you will never change. Some people might not on some things, others will. And we won't know until we actually engage in some kind of a dialogue. But we can't do that if we engage in cancel culture in particular, because that stops the conversation and says, this person will never change, therefore I am done engaging with them. Here's a quote from page 30. Quote, to this end, Freire asserts that those who avoid such encounters treat others as mere objects. Instead of nurturing life, they kill life. Instead of searching for life, they flee from it. And these are oppressor characteristics. Thus, similar to vitriolic callouts, canceling someone denies them as subjects and reduces them to immutable objects, end quote. However, the author does note that there are forms of cancel culture that may be beneficial. So here's an example from page 31. Quote, people who have been harmed by racial violence and trauma throughout their lives might strategically utilize cancel culture, not to dehumanize their interlocutors, but rather to humanize themselves by refusing to exhaust their emotional labor on someone who continuously commits violence through their ignorance, end quote. That resonated with me. I had a variety of people in my life who it's clear that this is not the moment for them to seek to understand other perspectives. And so while I might choose to not engage in dialogue with them on those topics in that moment, we can resume the conversation down the road at a point when they are more able to listen and engage in a two-way conversation rather than a monologue. All right, so the next section, starting on page 31, is titled The Ethics of Virtue Signaling. And so an approach that people tend to use in online discourse is actually recenter their whiteness by putting the spotlight on themselves and their virtue signaling, rather than centering on the experiences of marginalized people who are being oppressed. Here's a quote from Freire, which is quoted on page 32. Quote, pedagogy, which begins with the egoistic interests of the oppressors, an egoism cloaked in the false generosity of paternalism, and makes the oppressed the objects of its humanitarianism, itself maintains and embodies oppression. It is the instrument of dehumanization." End quote. This process of virtue signaling can create teams or tribes of in-group and out-group. This, too, is dehumanizing, and it puts groups against each other. Rather than engaging in dialogue with people outside of the group, you instead talk about the out-group within your group. Next subsection in here, tone policing, starts on page 33. So tone policing, again, is the idea that you're silencing or controlling through forms of gaslighting the oppressed. And according to the author, Freire said that emotion is an important and crucial role when engaging in dialogue, although with the caveat that it's not entirely based on emotion alone, but the argument certainly can have emotion. And so the author basically says that tone policing, quote, should generally be viewed as a dehumanizing tactic that is not in line with the ethos of Freirean dialogue, end quote. It's from page 34. The next subsection is on a pedagogy of love and humility. And so the author says that love was actually a precondition for dialogue and liberation. And so again, if we engage in behaviors that are dehumanizing, we end up flip the oppression to those who were formerly the oppressors. Okay, so the next section, starting on page 35, is titled Toward a Pedagogy of Humility. So this has subsections around non-superiority, unfinishedness, open-mindedness, and epistemological uncertainty. So let's quickly talk about each of those. So with regards to non-superiority, basically, if you want to engage in dialogue with people, you need to not assume that you have superiority over other people. So for example, some of the ways that people engage in discourse online engages in a dialogue that can come across as assuming, oh, I figured out this thing, and you have not, therefore I know more than you. This comes across as an air of superiority. If I were to speak to my younger self today, I would need to make sure that I did not engage in an air of superiority, because I would look at my younger self and be like, oh yeah, I remember when I used to think that. You're going to change your mind, here's why, etc. So engaging in a dialogue with somebody else, try to be very careful of not coming across in a condescending way, or in a way that comes across as you figured it out and are more superior than another person. A framing that resonates for me with this is what's called a beginner's mind in Buddhist discourse, and it's the idea of a glass that is half empty. From a Buddhist sense, it is half empty, meaning that it is open to be filled. So if you take a beginner's mind, you are open to learn new things, to be filled like a glass that is half empty. So if we engage in some kind of a dialogue, that might be something to consider. Make sure you're not coming across as superior to somebody else. Another thing to consider with the unfinishedness, which is the next subsection, is to remind yourself that everybody is unfinished. So as I was mentioning earlier, who I was 5 years ago is different than who I am now, and is different than who I'm going to be 5 years from now. That's true for everyone. If you ever feel like you have arrived at the correct solution to life, you will likely find that 5 years from now, you'll realize you did not arrive. You continue to learn new things and change. So we need to engage in conversations with people, acknowledging that both we are unfinished and the people we engage in dialogue with are also unfinished. Here's a quote from page 38. Quote, "We must recognize that no matter how far along some activists may consider themselves, the vast majority will likely have originated from within the same intellectual starting point, one in which they were systematically discouraged from engaging in critical thinking and questioning the status quo throughout their formative educational years. Viewed this way, one person does not inherently possess greater intellectual superiority or more virtuousness than another. There are only those who have begun the work of dismantling their neoliberal foundations sooner than others." End quote. And then the next subsection, open-mindedness. Again, this goes back to what I was discussing with the Buddhist concept of beginner's mind, or glass half empty, is being open to seeking to acknowledge and understand another person's worldview and even criticism of your own. Here's a quote from page 39. Quote, "If one adopts a closed-minded or absolutionist regard toward their interlocutor, the best one could hope for will be a monologue masquerading as a dialogue, where convincing the other of one's truth becomes the only goal." End quote. I don't know about you, but I've had so many conversations with people. They claim it's a dialogue, but really they're just trying to convince you of the thing that they believe. Whether it's like a salesperson, like we bought a car a few months ago and engaged with salespeople who did not care actually about what we were interested in buying and only wanted to sell the thing that they wanted to sell. And surprise, we did not buy from them. It's important for us to also consider, like myself, to go, oh, am I actually engaging in dialogue right now or not? Maybe. And the last subsection on here is epistemological uncertainty. And so this is what Patty Luther refers to as, quote, "praxis of not being so sure." end quote. So what this means is that critical pedagogy is often used in a dogmatic way, and so we need to make sure that when we are engaging in such a process that we do not dogmatize it. So there's an episode that I actually did on a paper by Thomas Rogalski called Methodolatry, so it kind of talks a little bit about that. So I'll include a link to that in the show notes. All right, so the last main section of this paper, starting on page 40, is toward a more dialogical social media culture. So in this section, the author describes how the nature of social media circles can kind of curate like-minded individuals. This can, quote, often serve to cocoon feelings of safety among the privileged, who might hide behind the screens as they defer personal responsibilities social justice causes in the real world. End quotes from page 40. So while it's nice to find groups of people that we might resonate with, we also need to be cautious about it. It's good to seek outside perspectives. Here's an important quote from page 41. Quote, on social media, as well as in our social lives, it becomes imperative to listen more than we talk, to seek to understand more than we seek to judge. Engaging with others through the potentially impersonal format of social media requires scrutinizing our interpersonal commitment to one another in the process. End quote. A little bit further down, this is a quote on page 41 and into 42. Quote, through the perspective of one's ego, outspoken displays of wokeness in the form of callouts or performative allyship might look and feel constructive, and indeed may introduce some degree of social awareness toward a particular issue. But the self-motivated nature of these exchanges will often leave the process falling short of its potential. As such, in the name of co-conspiratorship, one ought to look to the intended goals of these actions and critically examine how effectively the means justify the supposed ends. If one worthwhile aim of co-conspiratorship is the further promotion and transmission of its cause across the entire profession, then to what degree might a vitriolic approach to dialogue effectively realize this aim? End quote. And another quote from page 43, quote, surely, any educator should without hesitation endorse an ethic of love and caring toward their students, because it is within these very environments that students are known to feel empowered, to thrive. How, then, might we prioritize such an ethic among our students, but turn our backs on it when it comes to our peers? An ethic of care should not be viewed as merely developmental for the youth alone, but essential to all human interactions. After all, as educators, we should certainly rebuke any teacher resorting to personal condemnations and mean-spirited criticisms toward their students. Would our colleagues not also be best motivated by an ethic of support and tough love over a spirit of denunciation and dehumanization? End quote. A little bit further down on the same page. Quote, making anti-racism a widespread educational standard rather than the selective license of the woke alone can occur only when we affirm the capability of every last computer science educator to see themselves in this essential work and prepare the computer science education profession at large to take on their respective roles in the process, end quote. All right, and then the last section of this paper is a TLDR, too long didn't read, and so I'm not going to summarize that there because I just kind of summarized the whole paper. I do highly recommend taking a look at this paper, and again, you can find that in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. But at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to share my lingering questions and thoughts, and so one of them is, if you are in a marginalized group, how do you prefer co-conspirators collaborate with you? So as an example, I'm non-binary, one of the marginalized groups that I'm a part of. And when I hear people who are trying to be an ally for the trans community, there's a tendency to do so in ways that presents a false homogeneity within the trans community, which given that there are transgender, transsexual, non-binary, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, etc. identities all housed within the capital T trans umbrella, becomes problematic to say that everyone within this community thinks the same way. It even becomes problematic if you say that all non-binary individuals think the same way. So for me, I prefer co-conspirators to let individuals within the community represent themselves. So elevate or amplify voices, but don't take over the conversation and essentialize. But you might have a different perspective for a different marginalized group. Now, another question that I have is, in what ways do I unknowingly engage in these problematic forms of woke culture? When might that cause the opposite intended effect? Although I'm constantly trying to reflect and iterate and learn from others, it's hard to uncover unconscious biases. So a question that I have for you is, how do you seek to understand when you are engaging in problematic habits of communication? If you'd like to chat through this on the podcast or reach out privately, again, there's a contact me button on my website. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. This was a very interesting paper to read. I do highly recommend reading through it and sitting with it, reflecting on it. I read through this paper like about a month ago. It was good to revisit it after having some time to sit through it and think through it. But thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, hope you consider sharing it with somebody else or leaving a review on whatever app that you're listening to this on. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.